And we are recording. Hey everyone, again, this is another Void conversation. Today I'm here with Jonathan, who is the author of Apparently Unmanageable for the November edition of The Void. And Jonathan, how's it going?
Yeah, good. Yourself?
I'm doing all right. So I guess we'll jump right in. This is one of the more experimental pieces that I've seen in The Void, at least. So what is it about? Like, give me the quickest possible rundown. I know that's that's a too broad of a question, but
Yeah, no. I suppose uh, I'll start by illustrating like why I chose it to send it to you. So obviously, it's really nice what you guys are doing with like community publications. I hadn't come across that many before, and I've started coming across more recently, and it's a really nice thing to see. But of course, when you get a message on like online that says, oh, would you like to submit something to us? Part of you is like, oh, that's lovely. I'm really pleased that's happening. And part of you is like, yeah, but this must be some kind of elaborate phishing scam. So what I did was generally speaking, if I submitted something, it would usually be an extract from a novel project. But just in case, I chose something which I was still really happy with the content, but it wasn't tied to as much other content for the sake of not being too super sentimental about it. But essentially, it was I had done a segment from this novel project about education in New Zealand with regard to like my education, which like single sex state schools are surprisingly common in New Zealand. And it's sort of this big mess of like, there is actually some sort of nice education that you can, I mean, there is some content, but you can pretty much arrive finishing high school without having really experienced it. So I just took together like all of the really chaotic moments from different years and condensed them into one scene. And after doing that, I thought so the girls' version of my high school, I knew a lot of people from it, but had no real idea of what it was like. But I thought, and I sort of wanted to, I thought, what happens if I just take the exact attitude of the male characters from this version and kind of apply it to that? Not the same story at all, but the same environment and dynamic, and apply it to that. And how does it come out? And I checked it with a friend who went there, and she was like, more or less, yeah. Sorry, that was very long-winded, but yeah,
no,
sorry.
that was great. That's perfect. That's great. And you kind of talked about this overlaying of more like masculine sensibility, or kind of what we think of like as traditional male behavior with like female characters, um and then how it was actually you make some interesting points in your own critique of your own piece that is also published right behind it, which I thought was a super interesting idea. But you make this point that it's almost as if it feels exaggerated, but only because we don't think we like, because of our preconceptions. If I don't know if I'm wording that exactly correct, but that's how I read it, as if like we expect, because it's all female characters, for them to not act in ways we deem traditionally masculine and like aggressive and like swearing a lot and doing that. And yet in our own like innate rejection of that is actually an illustration of something much deeper, because it actually is true, even though it feels untrue. Is that
Mhm.
is that right? Is that what you're going for? Am I misreading? What do you think?
Um, it's pretty close. There's an aspect of culture barrier as well, and probably, I mean, so I currently live in Italy, and it's a lot more salient. But in New Zealand, the gender gap is a lot smaller than a lot of countries in terms of behavior. Um, Also in terms of work, like, I've worked manual jobs in New Zealand and had like more or less gender balanced, whereas in other countries that I've worked, not so. So I mean, there's sort of a factor um, in thinking like I'm probably in a better position to just do this straight overlay than someone from somewhere else would be. And I thought I mean, it's something that I quite like about New Zealand. I mean, obviously there are um, differences, not so much in behavior, but like experience differences are of course there. Um, but I thought it was probably a bit easier to do. And I had sort of worked on a couple of similar, like in the same vein projects that were less like comical, I guess. Hopefully it's comical. But there was an element of um, I don't know, like I mean, not. I tried to almost take like a comedically neo-Orientalist perspective towards my own culture and other like places that I've been, but like most notably England, because it's sort of this sort of like font of culture, where so an outsider's perspective on it is like, I don't know, I find it funny. Doubtless it's been done, um, but like anyway, sorry, about that. Um, yeah, like so it's more that I thought it would seem strange to people who had come from elsewhere, whereas I think most people that I showed it to from home would probably recognize it as a slight exaggeration, which it probably is.
Sure. I think that's really interesting. Obviously, having never been to New Zealand, I'm from the US. Um,
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point. I think the divide here between like our like gender divide here is much starker in that I think there is a lot of like we have very distinct stereotypical kind of views of like what is masculine and what is feminine, especially like here in the US. So I think as a reader not from that culture, it strikes me as very like it strikes me originally as very distinct and exaggerated and almost as if like almost unrealistic until I read the critique and I'm actually like, oh, I only feel that it's unrealistic because of like my
Mm,
own like silly preconceived notions. And then like you go back
mm,
and kind of reread it and I'm like, oh,
mm.
like that was
It
entirely like me overlaying onto it.
mm. It is like I definitely wouldn't want to give the impression that we don't have those sort of stereotypes as well, the sort of like archetype male and female. I think the difference is that it's more obviously divorced from reality to an extent. I mean, like you know, if I think about like university, sort of maybe there was more of a gender divide in people's styles and behaviors, which I think is like possibly a class thing. So like, you know, if you're in an area where people aren't being terribly physical, everyone's sort of like a, you know, brain in a box for a few years, um, then maybe you get that sort of thing as maybe that sort of stands out more. And then if you, you know, if you get into like the workforce, depending on your workforce, like if you're in an office, probably it stands out more. Um, but definitely like in the way people talk, the the divide is smaller. And maybe some people from like more conservative communities will have a like a pretty clear divide between male and female appropriate behavior, but to someone from outside that community, it'll look like people behave quite similarly.
Sure, absolutely. So let me jump to you bring up this point in the critique about quote unquote writing one's place, and I just want to know like
Mm.
what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean when you say that? What do you think it means?
Yeah, I'm real happy that you bring it up. Sorry. No, because it's super interesting to me. Like, um, I suppose the one place to start might not be the best place, but one of the best one I can think of now is that, in particular with like modern writing, where the novel's sort of gone from being the absolute dominant form, and I would argue that the function of the novel is currently being served by like memes, and that I'm not joking. I genuinely believe that, which I can elaborate on later. I think there'll be a good time to do it when you ask about like the reading list at the end, which you seem to do as a standard.
Sure,
Um, but so, like in general, it's really good to see that within the states in particular, there is still a good level of participation in literature and experimental literature, particularly with magazines. And it's kind of depressing to see that the that same level isn't as present elsewhere. I mean, if it is, it's more confined or less accessible or less salient. And that's not something to do with the US being like unrightfully dominant. It's more, you know, uh, it would be nice to see more writing coming from outside the US without diminishing the amount that comes from within it. Um, so an example that I can think of is so I have a contact who also writes from like from Eastern Europe, and they have like some of their project that's set in the States, and they do so quite convincingly. Um, and yeah, the projects themselves aren't undermined by the fact that they're writing from elsewhere. Um, but like for example, the first big novel project that I worked on was set in the States for lack of a consideration of like my own setting or any of my own settings or an alternative setting as like legitimate or convincing. So there's an element of wanting to, I mean, not subvert in the sense of like decrease the legitimacy, but basically to legitimize or to make it really obvious that it's possible to write one's own place in a valuable way. And I suppose the formal. So one of the things is that you'll be using like a different formal lexicon, like a different sort of repertoire of techniques, like a palette for a different place. There's some techniques that are more appropriate to the States, and I know when you've talked about like postmodern literature in the past interviews, the postmodern literature is obviously very broad, but the salient ones that tend to come up will be like Pinch and DeLillo, like these like experimental writers in quite a specific vein of postmodernism, whereas like someone like Arundhati Roy is very postmodernist, or like Margaret Atwood, but in very different ways. I'm sorry, I was just like lost my
No,
train there. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
it was good. It's really good. Yeah, there's definitely this. I think you began with this idea that kind of
Uh,
the massive corpus of literature coming out, especially right now, is all based around like the U.S. because of its kind of like hegemonic
uh, Sorry. Do you mind if
status.
I found my
Sure,
flow.
go
I
for it.
found
Yes, go
my
for
little
it.
file. Sorry, I know there's a delay, so it's kind of awkward if I step in. But so what I meant to say was it in like contrasting this kind of postmodern literature that comes out as salient, this American kind, with other kinds, like they can appear kind of different because they use different repertoires of techniques that work differently for different places. Like Arundhati Roy will use techniques that work really well for India or basically anywhere post-English colonial. America is also, but and a lot of that kind of lexicon of techniques works really well for New Zealand. And there's definitely some overlap with what sort of New Zealand authors like Kerry Hume do with she's like sort of New Zealand's answer to Ulysses. Um, Genius author, but quite kind of inaccessible. Although, like it's like a whole novel of prose poem, beautiful thing. And so when you're looking for a technical like lexicon to try to work out, I mean, you can either do it think about this as something you need for your own culture, or just for yourself as like a writer trying to do your own newer thing. You want to establish your own internally consistent like rule set of how you do things, especially because it's impossible to get your head around the established rule set. And when you try to look for established rules, you find like stuff transposed from Hollywood without any regard for setting and the different sets of constraints you operate under. So when you're writing your own place, what you want to do is to borrow from sources that seem like it would be appropriate. So I borrow a lot from writers like Hubert Selby and Irvine Welsh, who do a lot of like phonetic orthography, like phonetic transcription of speech, and you can see a little bit of that in Apparently Unmanageable. Probably it's not that obvious. I don't have the text of Apparently Unmanageable in front of me, but like with Bridge on the floor being like, "Oh, Nessie the Loch Ness, shut up here!" Like,
Yeah, yeah, of course.
it's like a long, I mean, so there's an phonetic orthography in particular. If we touch on that, is kind of a touchy one, because it can a lot of people who aren't used to it, the knee-jerk reaction is that it's supposed to be condescending, and so it's good to borrow from authors that do it in a dignifying way, so in order to like help you do it properly or for the right reasons in a way that works. So like Irvin Welsh, for example, in an interview, said that he had originally written Trainspotting in standard English, and it was just like a farce. It didn't make any sense. It was kind of disgraceful. And he just went back and reworked it into like phonetic Scots in a lot of places, because the standard English orthography, which is sort of wobbly enough anyway, just doesn't make any sense for Scots, really. And so it's very much, I mean, Irvin Welsh is simultaneously very like self-satirizing of being Scottish and very dignifying. And Hubert Selby is kind of the same, like not so much self-satirizing or like politically dignifying, but like he'll present things very much as they are. Like his motivation, which I've sort of combined the information from like the forewords and essays on Last of the Brooklyn. His attitude towards speech is within Brooklyn especially, and this was writing before Brooklyn was like a really sort of cultural hub. So he was very much writing from like a marginalized place. Was to basically treat language as he felt it worked in a city like Brooklyn, which is as an indistinct aspect of the general music of the setting. So he like ditched quotation marks and went for like essentially full phonetic orthography almost for at least the dialogue and the internal monologue generally, or sometimes only for keywords. And he like there's a beautiful short, because Last Exit to Brooklyn is like sort of detached but related stories, like Trainspotting, like many things. And there's a section called Coda, which is like it's basically a whole short story that consists of choruses of different families of different ethnic groups living in this apartment complex and like shouting at their wives or kids, or like having arguments or like gossiping about each other, or like the ladies in the courtyard smoking, like and so like borrowing aspects of that, like in particular use of chorus, so like within the text that like I sort of spiritually adapted into Apparently Unmanageable, it's like got sort of three layers of English. Like there's sort of an extract, it's like a speech presentation. There's an extract of Shakespeare, there's a lot of like standard English, and then I've got like phonetic Kiwi and choruses like heckling the speakers, in an effort to convey. So one of the general things about the Kiwi education, or about any education system, and it's probably more salient in Italy because people got sort of because everyone speaks like dialect, and there's standard Italian, which is sort of like Dante's Italian, and so a lot of people would have been sort of somewhat disadvantaged in the beginning when sort of integration was happening. Nowadays, I think most people speak standard Italian with no issues. But there was like definitely like a point at which the dominant language, or the dominant version of the language, was inappropriate for the teaching of people from like alternative backgrounds, and it quite possibly happens in the States in some places where people have like sort of Creole dialects that they speak growing up. I'm not entirely sure, and in New Zealand, it's the New Zealand sort of version of English is basically standard English except for pronunciation. But there is definitely an element in which like novel style language, like high English, so to speak, is not really accessible or relevant to people growing up in New Zealand. So you kind of, I mean, in the same way that when you want to learn maths properly, you have to learn like the language of maths. Either that, or you have to have someone who's willing to teach you maths in English, basically. Which, my God, I wish I'd had. I've never managed to learn maths as a language, or have an elaborate understanding. So, like with so when you're being taught Shakespeare, you have to break a language barrier. You need to read Shakespeare with a glossary because it is a different version of English. I mean, it's still modern English, but it's a much earlier version. And when you're reading, like, I mean, not Pynchon so much, a little bit Pynchon. I mean, just because there's so much scientific terminology in there.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, or if you're reading, like William Burroughs' Junkie, for example, which was written in like in the 50s, had to gloss the word cool because it didn't exist in English. Or I mean, it existed, but it was not that common of a term. So students who are learning English, if people don't really get into the habit of speaking literary English, which is almost exactly the same, except that really so much of the intended meaning of a text can go over your head if you don't really get into it. It's an aspect that disadvantages certain people who just aren't sort of like hip to this whole like thing. But then one of the sad things about it is that if you do learn how to read this kind of English, you end up trying to write it because you think it's more legitimate. Like I could end up trying to write like D.H. Lawrence or something, and that style of writing is just not relevant to my life or the way I want to communicate the world. Um, so, like, I mean, the topic of writing one's place, it can also be extended to writing one's time. Um, I think a lot of people will produce a lot of horrible, cringeworthy content of trying to deal with like the internet and the way people speak now and like meme culture. Um, but as I said, I genuinely believe that memes are now serving the function of like that novels used to, specifically novels, maybe poems, in terms of well, like each one is on a very small scale, like a metaphorical way of communicating something, often satirical. Um, so one thing, like I really like, as much as like a lot of the content is just terrible, I'm really enthusiastic about like sort of trash mediums like copy pasta. Um, like like integrate a lot of that kind of style, which I mean, that's not to say it's not like explicitly literary. A lot of the conventions in text like that, they come from like Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, and like Naked Lunch. A lot of like escalation sequences from like old style satire. They show up in there. Sorry, I can't remember exactly where we started. Like apart from writing one's place and what do I mean, but that must
It's all
basically what
good.
I mean. Basically, what
Uh,
I mean to round that point off is that it's about developing a technical vocabulary as well as discovering a satisfactory language. Oral storytelling is another big thing, and that can just be like if you're in the parking area at a party and like you just sort of reel off like what we'd call like a shit yarn, like a tall story to the people there. Being able to incorporate that language in the real language that you speak, as well as a technical vocabulary that is suitable to your place. That's what I mean. Sorry.
sure, absolutely,
After
right.
that.
So there's this need to, right. It'd be as if attempting to describe, oh, I don't know, to use like a U.S. example, right? Or you mentioned Brooklyn, right? If you're in like downtown New York or in the Bronx or something, and then writing a story that takes place in that setting in a like a James Joycey, like high English, everyone speaks very like properly using like long fancy clauses strung together and like without any of the technique, like without actually understanding what it's truly like to be there, because like that's how you're supposed to write or whatever, would, right, you lose what actually makes that place the place you're trying to write about if you don't have that like full understanding of how to write that.
Well, actually, the specific Joyce example, he's probably actually the father of using vernacular in like
Sure.
high prose because he blends the two indiscriminately almost.
Absolutely,
Um,
yeah. I'm just trying to think of who writes in.
yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah,
Like Beckett, for example. I
sure.
mean, he probably does incorporate a lot of vernacular, but yeah, or like I mean, it's more obvious with French authors like Camus and because there's like French they have like le bon usage, um, like the way that you're supposed to write and use words together that and they had at least then probably still now more uniform education in how to speak and use language, whereas in English it's really like I learned how to use commas properly when I was 17 because our teacher was so disgusted with our use of them in a creative writing assignment, so he took it on his own initiative to spend 2 lessons on remedial comma usage at 17, and it was not part of the syllabus. Um, and that was probably the most useful English lesson I ever had.
Right. That's fair. Um, I think
You're
I
right.
yeah.
Like,
I think I probably learned how to use proper grammar around 17 or 18 as well, just
mm,
by like lack of standardization amongst education requirements.
yeah. Yeah, New Zealand education, it doesn't have like you hear sort of like nightmare stories about American education. I don't know to what extent it's true, but we definitely have we had some educational reforms some years before I went through high school, and apparently they're gradually reapproximating it towards sort of what it was. Um, but there was much more like teaching to the test when I was at school than there had been previously, probably than there is now. Like you basically learn like one. the exact wording to the answer of one of like 6 questions, depending on the obviously what paper it is, what course. Like English obviously was more elaborative, but then I, unlike every other subject pretty much except French, was in like a streamed into a reasonably good English class. Like terrible, I was like the sort of bottom classes for like maths and this, but a higher of English. So I had exposure to like better text and better teaching systems or whatever, probably like maybe slightly more difficult. But a student who was going through one of the lowest streams, they probably want to teach it like so that the student will pass, and so they'll be studying like Ender's Game or something, and they'll basically learn how to regurgitate an answer about Ender's
Yeah,
Game.
exactly.
Yeah, which
That's
is
pretty close to how it is in the US. Well, there are some it's um split on two levels almost, right? Like if you are fortunate enough to be at a school with proper funding that even offers the more advanced track, and then you are able to like get yourself onto it, you then do have access to like teachers that actually care and like want to teach you how to think, to use cliche language, and you have access to like much to like legitimate works of literature and or like math or whatever. And obviously if you're on the lower track, again, it's exactly that. It is like, how can I teach you how to remember this thing so that you can pass? And then if you happen to be in a poorer district in the inner cities or something, you don't even have the opportunity for that at all. So we got we have plenty of problems with the US education system, that's for sure.
The variation in the US system is probably more extreme than in New Zealand.
Sure.
Especially because like I went to a state school, but I went to a state school in quite a nice area. And like sort of people that I know that went to schools in worse areas, probably on average got less sort of support and encouragement from like teachers. I could have finished school with absolutely nothing, and I was just sort of helped at a couple of really crucial times. But so even going to like, quite a decent state school and quite a decent area, I still could have had that same experience of getting nothing out of high school. And I sort of like, basically that. It's the floor is very low, essentially. But I mean, then at the same time, like I believe, sort of at least in most schools, like everyone does some Shakespeare. Like, it's not like you won't get to deal with texts that are important. It's just that you won't engage with them in a like. I remember we had like film study, and we watched Pan's Labyrinth, and then just without any of us noticing, we never ever received any secondary material on Pan's Labyrinth. And I don't know if you've seen Pan's Labyrinth, but you cannot write about Pan's Labyrinth without secondary material, particularly about its relevance to the Spanish Civil War. It just doesn't make sense. So I remember in my final like exam, which I think I did really well at, I wrote about um, a film that I hadn't watched as part of English, like just another one, and I wrote about like Fight Club, whose book I couldn't remember the quotes from, so I used those from the film, and like just like wrote reasonably well, sort of like pulled some stuff out of my ass, but relied on the sort of ignorance of the marker to not realize that I hadn't actually read it, and I was like responding to a different text almost. Which I mean, I then ended up like sort of studying literature more, like sort of caught up in some ways, and I read a lot privately, but I could have gone through and had that same like absolute gap in knowledge. It happened to be that I got interested in it later. Sorry, long spiel about nothing. But.
No, it's okay. I, I know you mentioned you want to do this at the end, but I'm interested if we could expand on what you mean when you say you think that the form of like the dominant form of the novel is being is being taken over by meme culture currently. Like just riff on that if you can.
All right, so it's easiest to demonstrate with like satirical content. And like, I mean, it would be easier if I had like a meme in front of me but I mean, basically, so a novel is kind of about presenting content, like so much of the form of novel is about analogy, and so much of the form of a meme, of any kind of meme, is about analogy. Um, so I do have a piece of content that I can read out. I think it'd take about 3 minutes, if you'd be okay with that. It's like an escalation sequence. So a lot of like, I mean, you find these things in like Naked Lunch and in a lot of old school satire will be like, there'll be an initial impression and then there'll be like an escalation sequence to catastrophe. It's like a satirical thing. And particularly in like copy pasta, this thing sort of, I mean, it's just such a thing. Like the content of copy pasta is often terrible and the satirical intent is often terrible. There's a lot
Just
of
for
like,
anyone who
yeah.
doesn't quite know what copy pasta is, what is it? Just real quick.
Hmm. So essentially it's like a piece of text that is entertaining for what the content is. It's shouldn't be like, you know, like, oh, this person said something really cool, I'm going to share it. It's more like a piece of text that is entertaining to look at because like, oh my God, what is that? So if they're, you know, they could be generated by a user or found in the wild, so to speak. You know, say someone writes like a terribly cringeworthy post about one of their like obscure and kind of morally questionable fetishes. And so someone just takes that content and is like, everyone look at this, and like, you know, ideally not, you know, drawing attention back to the user or whatever, chucking it there. Or so the one that I actually quite like, I mean, it's sort of ridiculous, but at the same time it does make quite a nice point. So a lot of people, they'll see how like you know, a company supports like you know, like a progressive movement, and they'll be kind of like you know, that person might support the same progressive movement, but they might find the way that the company does it kind of grotesque, and this kind of articulates it quite well. So there's one that goes around during Pride Month, which is like uh, greetings, fellow homosexual. We've changed the color of our logo to a rainbow. Now that your lifestyle has been federally legalized and is completely socially safe, why didn't we support you before? No more questions, homosexual. Buy our product, buy our product, buy our product. And like, obviously, there's various versions of that, like, you know, like sort of civil rights oriented ones, feminism oriented ones. And it's cheap and it's trashy, but at the same time, it can be a vehicle for delivering truth. Um, so, I mean, let me see. I'll read this out, and I apologize in advance.
No, go for
Um,
it.
so it's called the Merciless Current. Um, a procession of TV chefs. A procession of TV chefs awaits judgment on their food. The first of them takes 2 polite steps up onto a raised platform before a panel of minor celebrities at a 3-place dining table decked with checkered red bistro cloth. The ranking panelist has delivered their preliminary summary of the contestants' menu and is preparing to pass sentence. We are anticipating 2.5 minutes of cuts to faces, food, and furniture before the score swells from a blend of NASA pre-launch countdown and sneak themes into despair or reconciliation harmony as the revelation is made. All these shots are indeed presented, but in rapid fire, compressed into a single second's runtime, after which the judge delivers a concise and helpful assessment of the food. Thank you, chef. Departs. The next contestant steps meekly up as the judge begins to summarize. Her monologue speeds up beyond comprehensibility. The cuts to faces, food, and flashback are strobed through, the chef judged and dismissed in the course of a half second. The audio slowing as she departs from the stand, just enough to make audible her helium-pitched, "Thank you, chef." White VHS fast-forward lines begin to tear across the shot as the queue of 3 remaining chefs are suctioned almost simultaneously up to the podium, their individual retrospectives coalescing into a single sequence of almost superimposed images and drawn immediately offset by the merciless current of accelerated time. The perspective cuts to that of a boom-mounted camera tracking backwards over the heads of the audience, who are magnetized out of the babbling space like iron filings and replaced with an identical crowd as a cast of interchangeable chefs is processed, dismissed, and relieved by another. As the camera reaches the back corner of the seating area, the shot slips out the back of it through its workings and recedes up and away from the boom crane over the isometrically oriented set. Chefs and audience are now arriving and departing in continuous flow. as the widening shot reveals a procession of 1940s German steam engines discharging batches of cast and crowd backstage right. Backstage left, the retired cast are stripped and dismantled by multi-armed factory machines, incinerated in a conveyor belt procession of coffins now resembling a time-lapse shot of a highway. Sound effects of industrial chaos. Alternative sets are now visible in an animated polyptych of Inferno. Booms, windscreen wiping over the sets, generations of cast and audience discharged by an elaborate network of heavy and light rail, buses, ferries, light aircraft, blimps, and hot air balloons. Variations on cast disposal, full body mincing like cattle, dissolution in cauldrons of acid, chorus of auto-tuned medieval agony, remains pumped, carted, airlifted back in the direction from which the vehicles come, roar of engine Doppler in all directions. A volcano booms over the spectacle, its flare illuminating the blackened steel rigging of a cavernous warehouse. A billion helium-pitched screams knit into a continuous wavering ring. The warehouse spectacle fizzes grey-white and fades to a purple and white text banner. You asked for this. Donate now. I mean, that might be somewhat incomprehensible and like delivered like that. But I mean, first I'll ask you, like, could you understand it at all, Diego?
A little. It's a little difficult. Of course, over Zoom. So how about? Can you give us a like a quick rundown of what exactly happened?
Yes, my apologies. So it just begins
It's
with
not your fault.
I'm certain that it is. But anyway, so I mean, you know the whole, like, if you watch or whatever, like Hell's Kitchen,
Sure.
they'll have the chefs coming up to be judged, and they'll say, oh, you made lamb with lemon whatever starters, and and you had a hard time with the oven, whatever. You opened it too much and your food was raw. And then they'll spend like 5 minutes sort of panning around with the camera, focusing on people's faces while tense music builds up before delivering so you expect this to happen. And what they do is they very kindly condense all of those shots into 1 second. So you're like, oh, nice. The next contestant is judged. Everything is sped through massively, including stuff you wanted to hear. Like, okay, what happened? And everything begins accelerating more and more. They're having to like incinerate the cast because they're just going through them so fast. They have no space. And you sort of get this progression out to like a chaos. I mean, the sort of obtuse point, which is like made even more grotesquely obtuse by the fact that I'm having to spell it out, is that it's sort of like taking a straw man of what people say that they want and saying, oh, I bet you want this extreme version of that. I mean, yeah, Jesus, dear God.
Of course. Yeah.
But yeah,
that was helpful. That is extremely helpful.
I mean, yes, hopefully. But yeah,
I apologize for the medium forcing you to explain the joke, which of course.
I mean, by all means, I could have chosen a less obtuse reading, quite possibly. But these kind of sequence, as I said, like Burroughs' sort of Naked Lunch has a lot of really similar sequences. I don't know if you've read it.
I have not read Naked Lunch, but it is on my ever-growing list of things to read.
It is. I highly recommend it, and I highly recommend reading either or both of Junkie and Queer before doing so, by the same author. But anyway, there are a lot of these kinds of sequences. There's one sort of about atomic testing from one of the same author's other things. But the tradition kind of goes back to Jonathan Swift and his Modest Proposal, which, like, it was mentioned by one of your other submitters, the one about talking about the Irish potato famine and suggesting the eating of children. So the point of that was there was this climate of social engineering, which was the same climate that sort of produced Marx. Any sort of lettered and leisured person was coming up with their own like panacea solution to world's ills. And a lot of these sort of concepts were like really inhumane. So what Jonathan Swift did is he took an idea like and decided, like, I'll write a whole essay deadpan serious and see how this idea plays out throughout the whole essay, like sustained satire. And like J.G. Ballard does the same thing in Crash, the one with like the people who have fetishes for automobile crashes. The idea was saying we're so fascinated with car crashes. Why? And advertising with equating cars with the physical body in a lot of ways. He said, I'm going to take the concept that car crashes are sexy, and I'm going to play this out over the course of a gratuitous novel. And Burroughs does a lot of sequences like there's a lot of kind of pederastic hanging sequences in Naked Lunch. And his explanation for this was that people were so keen on like the death penalty for drug addicts at the time, was sort of baying for it. He said there must be some kind of prurient interest in this. So a lot of the content that I had been doing, of which, yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm not sure if anyone will enjoy that example in that form of delivery, but a lot of the content is like meta satire of imagine someone trying to satirize a concept that they don't properly understand. Like, for example, I had done a similar, much more distressing and much longer sequence on like abortion, basically taking an example of like an anti-abortion satire that is just so out of touch, it's distressing. And saying, oh, this is what you want. That's what it'll look like. But yeah, perhaps I think I probably answered the question. I think anyone who's got this far is probably ready to shift gear. So.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Super interesting. I guess it's been great. I do have to run relatively soon, so I will hit you with the standard cliche final question, which is if speaking to a reader or someone who loves to read or someone who wants to love to read, what would be your 3 to 5 to however many you want book recommendations to them, and why, of course?
So I think when you first asked me that question, and like just the individual text, I had said that my standard answer to the question is Candide, but I wouldn't give it because I thought it was too cliched. But so it depends on sort of the reason you're recommending it, and whether you're recommending it really to everyone or people with specific goals. So Candide is the one that I would normally recommend to basically everyone. I've read it a lot, like aloud to people with English as a second language, because it's reasonably easy to understand. A lot of people are just amazed by the fact that it was written 300 years ago, or no, 1770s or 80s, so 250 years ago. And it's one of the most important, like, firstly, it's a nice sort of sustained use of satire. And secondly, it's just a beautiful, like, philosophical, it helps you evaluate your priorities. Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, because it's the father of a lot of it's a great way of tackling inhumane concepts using comedy, which is one of the most important functions of comedy, is to present something really sort of abhorrent and disgusting, and make it simultaneously palatable and scarier. So that's one thing, and it's also the father of a lot of modern, like, pastors and other sort of meme culture conventions and newer things. I would recommend William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, but I would not recommend that to everyone. The main reason for that is that it just takes a ridiculous amount of time. I mean, it can, you can have a single reading of it and enjoy it quite a lot, but you will, if you go back and reread it, you will notice individual passages that you had just totally forgotten were there, because it like, and it's also best if you approach it in, like, starting at the beginning is not necessarily the best way to approach it, because so many things are so insular. It's made up of a lot of self-contained stories, and a lot of people find a lot of its content to be extremely random, whereas like actually essentially nothing in it is random. So it makes for fantastic rereading. Like, I've carried it around for like 3 or 4 years traveling, because it's like luggage efficient, basically. To the answer of the original question, I've given The World is an Orange in the Sun, which is a Kiwi novel, and I had taken a screenshot or photographed the like the opening passage, what I thought just like beautifully articulated why the book is important. So it's from the perspective of a housewife who's essentially living entirely vicariously through the things around her, but it's this beautiful like metaphor for what reading is. um it opens with her having this momentary hallucination of seeing the world from her baby's eyes as she hands it an orange, and him just having this moment of this intense sweet world of like, you know, sort of light and juiciness, whatever. um and then, you know, the whole thing sort of, it's a great way of being like trying to work out how to approach life, because we all kind of have this sort of brain in a box life these days, um and trying to still have something worthwhile in there. um Aside from that, I had recommendations for alternative media. um Tim and Eric, you've watched Tim and Eric? Have
Nope,
you come across any of it?
I
Do you know
have
who they
not.
are?
I cannot
um
say I have.
I suspect that some people listening or watching will have seen bits of it, and I suspect that not many of them, if any, will have gotten very deep into it. Um, but it's extraordinarily influential on modern comedy. If you've seen any of like the Eric Andre show or other like really bizarre
Sure.
really alternative editing, they kind of pioneered that. Aside from like Monty Python, um, and they have some like, I mean, essentially it's all beautiful satirical content. And then yeah, like if you want to look at vocabulary for trying to depict the modern like sort of digitized consciousness, then yeah, things like YouTube poops, montage parodies, and pasta. But
Awesome.
yeah, that was, oh, and for writing one's own place, Last Exit to Brooklyn, Train Spotting, and the God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, who writes English better than God writes English. um
Awesome. That's
yeah,
fantastic. This has been great, super interesting, and I certainly hope we'll see you again here soon.
yeah, splendid. It's been chill, and I hope to see more of these of your other submitters. They're super interesting. I'm halfway through the Brianne Agnesel one. It's great
Awesome.
content. All right,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.